Okay, today we are going to begin reading the New Testament. As I said yesterday, we're going to be starting with the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so why is the Gospel of Mark called the Gospel of Mark? Well, we believe that a guy named Mark wrote it. We first read, now the Gospel of Mark itself does not identify its author in any way. None of the Gospels identify their authors by name. Luke and John both refer to themselves at a certain point in the Gospel, but they don't declare who they are. Matthew and Mark make no obvious self-references at all. It is a testimony of the early church that a guy named Mark wrote this book. We see this character called Mark. He's also called John, and John also called Mark. We see him throughout the rest of the New Testament. We see him for the first time mentioned in Acts 12, when it is specified that the early church, at least a portion of them, were staying at his house, the house of the mother of Mary, the house of Mary, mother of John, also called Mark. You read about that in Acts 12. That's where Peter went when he was released from prison by the angel in Acts 12. Before he left the city altogether, he went to that place to tell the others that he was all right and he was on his way out. And then he left the city altogether. We read about this house in connection to a woman named Mary and her son John, also called Mark. It's believed that this was an early church meeting home. As I said yesterday, it's speculated that this house may have been where Jesus and his apostles had the Last Supper. We speculate this in addition to it being a known location where the church met in Jerusalem. But Mark, the Gospel of Mark, also has a reference to a young man who followed Jesus and his apostles to the Garden of Gethsemane the night of Jesus' arrest, and fled afterwards, wearing nothing but a sheet. He wasn't properly dressed. And so this person, whoever this young man is, must have followed them at a distance without the others, at least the other apostles, knowing about it. None of the other Gospels mention it. He probably was asleep and woke up and followed them and the only thing he could put on in time to follow them was this linen sheet. And most believe that was probably Mark himself. If that is the case, then he most likely in his house asleep while Jesus and his apostles were having their meal well into the night. Then they got up to go. Apparently Mark woke up while they were getting ready or while they were on their way out. He followed them all the way to the Garden of Gethsemane, fled when the troops moved in to arrest Jesus. And probably, so if that's him, if that is the author, and it probably is, then that makes an even stronger argument that they were meeting in his house previously. Anyway, we don't know that for certain. It's very likely. We don't know for certain. We do know that the early church met in his house later on, and he became an associate of both the apostles Peter and Paul. After Acts 12, we read about him going with Paul and Barnabas on part of their first missionary journey. He then left them. He did not continue on with them at that time for reasons that are not explained. But he did not leave the church, or whatever his problem was. Whatever was going on. We'll talk about that when we get to Acts. We don't know. But he did not leave the church. Whatever issue he was having was not enough for him to leave the church or to turn his back on God. He eventually became reacquainted with Paul and Peter as well. Both of them referred to him as someone with them and useful to them later on in their epistles, and especially in conjunction with Rome. We know that Mark ended up in Rome. He was there with Paul and Peter in the early 60s, probably AD, and that's probably where the Gospel of Mark took its final form, at least. I mentioned yesterday that I believe Mark and Matthew both probably came into being. The Gospels, the written accounts of Mark and Matthew both probably came into being like in stages. Now, we don't really think of this. This kind of goes against our sensibilities when we talk about the Bible being inerrant and all that. I've mentioned that before in the Old Testament videos. We have this picture in our heads that these men who wrote the scriptures just kind of sat down at a table somewhere like were possessed by the Holy Spirit, who moved their arms and fingers to produce written words in a document, and the human author had no input or role in that procedure, and the Holy Spirit just kind of like moved through this person to produce this written document. And I don't know. I was never there. I don't know what that looked like. I had never been seized by the Holy Spirit to utter prophetic utterances given to me straight from God. I've never been seized by the Holy Spirit to write prophetic recordings given to me straight from God. I've never been around anyone who has. Okay, I've never seen that. I don't know what that looks like. I'm going to be very skeptical of anyone who claims to have seen that in their lifetime. So I don't know what that's like. And when we talk about the written word in particular, very few people in history ever experienced that. Only the people who wrote this. And there are only a few dozen of those throughout the entire course of human history. And the most recent one of those died 1900 plus years ago. So I don't know what that experience is like. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what it feels like. I don't know how to explain it or describe it or even relate to it. But I think that when we get to the letters, because I know the letters came into being when the apostles, for the most part, the New Testament letters came into being when the apostles were speaking out loud and someone was writing down what they were saying. There's all this in the Old Testament too. A lot of times that's how the prophets and messages were recorded. Jeremiah even gives us a couple of examples of him speaking a message and Baruch, his scribe, writing it down. So that did happen. Okay, now I don't know if that happened in the case of the Gospels. I don't get the impression. Now John may have been. When you read the Gospel of John, I get the sense that an old man is sitting around talking, and then a bunch of younger people are sitting around listening to him and writing down what he says. That's what I get the sense out of the Gospel of John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, however, don't come across that way to me. They all come across to me as though a human writer is sitting down and carefully working out what he's writing. And so I suspect that Matthew and Mark, at least, both had multiple versions of them produced before they came into the final form that we now have. I held up yesterday the example of a series of video games that are in their 7th or 8th iteration. I mentioned that yesterday. And how they are very clearly recognizable as, I played, these games are of course the old Final Fantasy games. I played Final Fantasy 1 last summer, June 2023, on this new version of it, this 8th or so version of this game. And I played most of the other versions too. Not all of them, but most of them. It's still very recognizably the same game. Okay, when I was playing Final Fantasy 1 over the last summer, it was still very recognizably Final Fantasy 1. Okay, even though the game itself, as I mentioned, had no underlying tissue connection to previous versions of that game. All the code had been rewritten, all the artwork had been redrawn, all the music had been recorded. It's like it had nothing left over from the original versions of the game that were still in this newer version, and yet this newer version was a faithful enough recreation of the original game that I could tell it was the same game. And I suspect that something like that happened with Matthew and Mark in the early years of the church, that there probably were previous versions of both of these Gospels that did not end up surviving, or if they did, Matthew's Gospel may have survived and was corrupted by other groups that were present at the time. And I think that goes a long way to explaining why the Gospels are the way they are. But that goes against what we normally think of when we think of the inspired and inerrant scriptures. And I've talked about that before in previous videos. Okay, so Mark is a member of the early church. He was probably a very young man at the beginning of the church time. If he is the young man in Mark 14:50, he was probably maybe a teenager. He seems to still be in his mother's house when Peter escapes from prison in Acts 12, which is a few years later. So he was probably a very young man when the Gospels themselves happened. He may have been part of, if his family was associated with Jesus, especially if they were close enough to Jesus that Jesus had the Last Supper in their house. Mark may very well have been part of that wider group of apostles or disciples that followed Jesus around at least part of the time. His mother may have been too. We do read about other women, a bunch of women who followed Jesus around, and Acts 12 specifically mentions Mark's mother as the person who owned that house, or that was her house. So she may have been one of those women. She may have been that group of women that were financial supporters of Jesus and followed him around. In which case, Mark would have been familiar with Jesus from a very young age. So it's possible that, we don't know, again, there's no way to establish this clearly, although it does seem likely that Mark was at least present in the Garden of Gethsemane. But he may have been part of that wider group of disciples who followed Jesus around at least part of the time. Or at the very least, he was aware of what Jesus was doing in his ministry throughout Galilee and all the other parts of Israel. If Mark himself may have been too young to follow Jesus around during that actual time period. But he seems to have been aware of it. However, the gospel as we have it, in addition to possibly being a mixture of Mark's own memories, is also based on the teaching of Peter. Because as I mentioned, Mark was an associate of both Peter and Paul in their days, especially when they got to Rome around 60 or so AD. We don't know when exactly Peter got to Rome, or Mark for that matter. When Paul writes his letter to the Romans around 57 AD, he greets a lot of people there. At the end of the letter to the Romans, he has a lot of names there of people that he's saying hi to, basically. And he does not mention Peter or Mark, so presumably they were not in the city at that time. I don't know, maybe he just didn't like Peter or Mark, he didn't greet them, I don't know. So presumably they came to the city afterwards, after 57 AD. We really don't know. But they were there at some point, and they both, in their lives there, Peter, Paul, and Mark, are all believed to have died and been martyred in Rome in the mid-60s AD. In July of 64 AD, there was a fire in the city of Rome. It's a very famous incident, the fire of Rome. And the emperor at the time, Nero, blamed the Christians for it. And so that gave him, he used that as permission to then begin a program of persecution against the Christians, at least in the city of Rome itself. I don't know how widespread it was outside of Rome itself. That lasted basically until Nero's death. Now, the following emperors after him did not pursue that policy, at least for a time. But there was a period of time in the mid-60s AD when at least the Roman Christians were under intense persecution at the hands of Nero, who blamed them for the fire that happened in July of 64 AD. He died in June of 868 AD. So that period of persecution lasted less than 4 years. I don't know if it started immediately after the fire or if it took some time for that to all come together. At any rate, the fire happened in July of 64 AD. Nero died, I believe, on June 9th, 68 AD. So it was during that time period, probably, when the Gospel of Mark took its final form, although, like I said, I suspect it was known in some version prior to that. The testimony of the early church is very consistent and affirmative in that Mark himself was the author of this Gospel. And as we read through this Gospel, we will see numerous indications that Peter himself had a large hand in it, because Peter is emphasized. Yes, he's emphasized in all the Gospels, but he's particularly emphasized in this one. So, even though Peter himself did not write this Gospel, we can attribute much of the existence of this Gospel much to Peter, which is part of the reason why Peter was the overall leader of the apostles. That seems very clear. He also wrote 2 epistles and was probably responsible for the content in the book of Mark. So he was a primary figure in the formation of the New Testament itself. And he was also a member of Jesus' inner circle of 3, as was John, who also was responsible for a gospel and 3 epistles and Revelation. So of the 25 books of the New Testament, 8 of them came from these 2 guys, so, which is partially why they're so prominently emphasized in the gospel accounts. Okay, so that's that for the background. Yeah, I believe that's... Oh, Mark, again, Mark was in Rome with Peter and Paul at some point in the early to mid-60s AD. The book as we have it now probably took its final form sometime in the mid-60s AD, when the Christians in Rome were coming under attack from Emperor Nero. Now again, there may have been versions of the gospel that were written before that, but the one that we have now probably came into being during that time. Paul and Peter and Paul and Mark, from what I understand, all died in this wave of persecution in some way or another. So the last version of the book would have been written, would have finished, presumably not long before Mark's death. And it was written to Christians in Rome. It's written to Romans. It's not written to Jews. Now, it's written by a Jew. Okay, Mark was a Jew, as was Peter, as was Paul, as was all the early apostles and all the early members of the church. But he's not writing to Jews. Matthew is writing to Jews. Mark is not. He is a Jew, Jewish background, but he is writing to people that he does not assume that his audience is familiar with Jewish customs. So he explains Jewish customs. He translates Aramaic phrases. He assumes a Roman background to his audience. The way the gospel is written, he makes several pointed challenges to his audience, presumably under the background of Roman persecution of them. He does not translate Roman, Latin terms and phrases or customs. He does translate Jewish, Aramaic terms, phrases, or Jewish customs. So he is not assuming familiarity with Jewish customs in his audience. He is assuming familiarity with Roman customs and Roman names and words and figures. Now he is not particularly focused. He is focused on demonstrating that Jesus is the Son of God. Like the thread line of his gospel is establishing that Jesus is the Son of God. We're going to be starting the entire gospel with that phrase, the beginning of the gospel, Jesus Christ, Son of God. And then throughout the gospel, the characters are going to be asking themselves, who is this guy? Who is this figure? And at the end, a Roman centurion is going to affirm this is the Son of God. But he's not trying to necessarily persuade an unbelieving audience. Like Mark is assuming his audience, the people who are reading his gospel, are already Christians. So he is not attempting to convert them, per se, with his gospel. He is not attempting to persuade them or give them... He's attempting to tell the story of people coming to the conclusion that Jesus is the Son of God. But he's not necessarily attempting to persuade non-believers into becoming believers. He's assuming that his audience is already believers. Now, Matthew will go to great ends to demonstrate to his Jewish audience that Jesus is the figure of the Old Testament, the promised Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Mark is not really doing that. He is assuming his audience already believes that, and he is writing the story to confirm their faith and motivate them to stick to it, even in the midst of hardship and oppression for it, and challenging them to continue living and professing their faith even if they're afraid to. So that's the theme and style and backdrop of the Gospel of Mark.